Let's get right into it. The guillotine, when justice turned into a spectacle. For generations, the guillotine was praised as progress. When it was introduced during the French Revolution, it was hailed as a machine of fairness, an intervention meant to bring equality to death. No longer would execution depend on the strength of the executioner or the cruelty of the method. No more botched hangings, no prolonged suffering, just a single blade falling cleanly, ending a life in an instant. At least, that was the promise. But history rarely unfolds the way it is advertised. The guillotine did not operate in silence. It operated in public squares, at dawn, before massive crowds. People gathered early. They traveled long distances. Vendors sold food and drinks. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders so they could see. What was meant to be justice became theater, and the crowd mattered, because over time, something unsettling became clear. The executions were not calming society. They were changing it. The crowds didn't grow quieter, they grew louder. They didn't become reflective, they became entertained. Laughter, cheering, and applause became common reactions to the blade falling. Then came the stories that would haunt the guillotine forever. Witnesses began reporting that severed heads did not immediately go still, that eyes blinked, that mouths twitched, that expressions shifted. Some claimed the heads looked around, as if aware, even if only for a few seconds. Doctors argued fiercely over whether consciousness could persist after decapitation. Some physicians attempted crude experiments, calling out names or clapping, trying to observe reactions. Whether these reactions were reflexes or something more did not matter. The damage was psychological. The public could no longer unsee the possibility that death was not as instant as promised. But the true breaking point wasn't medical, it was moral. In 1939, France carried out what would become its last public guillotine execution. The scene horrified officials. The crowd surged forward. People posed for photographs. The execution resembled a festival more than a moment of justice. The state finally understood something it had ignored for centuries. When death is made public, it does not teach restraint. It teaches desensitization. Executions were moved behind prison walls immediately after. The guillotine lingered for a few more decades, but its role was over. Eventually, capital punishment itself was abolished in France. The machine that once symbolized progress was dismantled and removed from public life. The guillotine was banned not because it failed. It was banned because it succeeded too well at revealing something deeply disturbing about human nature. LSD without consent, when the human mind became a test site. In the middle of the 20th century, fear ruled global politics. The Cold War was not just about weapons and territory, it was about control. Governments believed their enemies were developing ways to manipulate thought, behavior, and perception. And in that fear, a dangerous conclusion was reached. If the enemy might be controlling minds, then minds must be studied, at any cost. What followed was a series of psychoactive human experiments that crossed a line humanity would later swear never to cross again. Powerful hallucinogens like LSD were administered to human subjects without their knowledge or consent. Some were soldiers, some were hospital patients, some were ordinary civilians who believed they were participating in harmless interviews or routine tests. They were not told what they were given. They were not warned what might happen. For many, the effects were immediate and terrifying. Reality fractured, time warped, paranoia set in. Some experienced overwhelming fear, convinced they were losing their sanity. Others felt watched, followed, or hunted. For some, the experience never fully ended. Panic attacks persisted for years. Hallucinations returned without warning. Depression deepened into something unmanageable. Families watched loved ones change overnight with no explanation. Careers collapsed, relationships ended. Some people never recovered. The most chilling part wasn't the drug itself. LSD is now studied carefully in controlled, consensual medical settings. The horror was the intent behind its use. Authorities deliberately altered perception, memory, and identity without permission, simply to observe the outcome. When these programs were eventually exposed, even the investigators were disturbed by what they found. Records had been destroyed, files were missing, entire portions of the history were gone. Some deaths connected to the experiments were quietly dismissed or reclassified. The full scope may never be known. What terrified lawmakers and ethicists was not just what happened, but what could happen if such practices were allowed to continue. If a government can secretly rewrite a person's reality, then no freedom is secure. The human mind itself becomes territory to be occupied. Non-consensual psychoactive experimentation is now banned under international law, not restricted, not paused, banned. Because once authority claims ownership over perception itself, there is no boundary left to protect. Human crash test subjects, the knowledge written in bodies. Modern safety feels invisible. Seatbelts, airbags, helmets, reinforced frames, we trust them instinctively, rarely questioning where that knowledge came from. But before crash test dummies, before simulations and sensors, scientists needed real data. They needed to know how much force the human body could withstand, how quickly organs failed, what kind of impacts caused fatal injuries. And sometimes, the only available test subject was a human being. In the early days of aviation and automotive research, researchers placed themselves into violent experiments. Rocket sleds accelerated to extreme speeds and slammed to a stop in seconds. The forces were enormous. Bones fractured, vision blurred, internal injuries accumulated over time. These experiments were often voluntary, driven by belief in progress and safety. The researchers believed the risk was justified, but belief did not make the damage disappear. Each test pushed the body closer to its limits, and with every success came a question no one wanted to ask out loud. If this goes wrong, is the knowledge worth a life? As technology advanced, that question became impossible to ignore. Mechanical dummies could absorb force without injury. Sensors could capture data without pain. Computer models could simulate impacts no human body should ever experience. Once alternatives existed, the ethical justification collapsed. Human crash testing did not end because it lacked value. It ended because it demanded too high a price. The practice faded quietly, replaced by safer methods, but the legacy remains. Every safety regulation written today carries the imprint of those early experiments. Knowledge bought with bruises, broken bones, and bodies colliding with physics at full force. Modern safety was not gifted to us. It was learned the hard way. And once we understood that, we decided no more lives would be placed in that seat. Agent Orange, the weapon that continued the war after it ended. Most weapons announce themselves. You hear them, you see them, you know when they arrive and when they stop. Agent Orange did none of that. It drifted and it settled, and then it waited. During the Vietnam War, Agent Orange was deployed on an unprecedented scale. Millions of gallons were sprayed from aircrafts over dense jungles and farmland. The goal was not to kill directly, but to strip away nature itself. Trees were reduced to nothing, crops withered, the land became exposed, visible, and easier to control. But hidden inside the chemical mixture was something far more dangerous than anyone was willing to admit. Dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds ever created by the industrial processes, invisible, odorless, and persistent. When the spraying stopped, the war did not end for the people exposed to it. The dioxin did not break down. It did not wash away. It bound itself to soil, to water, to fat cells inside the human body. It entered the food chain, and it entered bloodlines. Years later, children began to be born with severe deformities, limbs missing, spines twisting, organs malfunctioning. Some never lived long enough to be named. Others survived, but required lifelong care. In villages near heavily sprayed regions, entire generations were affected. Veterans returned home believing they had survived the war. Then the cancers appeared, aggressive, unusual cancers, neurological disorders, immune system failures, conditions that doctors struggled to explain until patterns emerged. This was not a delayed injury. It was a continuing one. Even decades later, certain areas remained contaminated, soil still testing positive. Cleanup operations continue to this day. Children are still born affected. Families still carry the burden of exposure they never consented to. The chemical didn't care about borders, it didn't care about treaties, it didn't care about peace. It turned landscapes into long-term weapons. As the full scope of the damage became undeniable, international condemnation followed. Chemical defoliants of this type became symbols of unchecked military experimentation. Agent Orange was banned not because it failed to achieve tactical goals, but because it revealed something deeply disturbing. Some weapons do not stop killing when the war ends. They rewrite the future instead. And once humanity understood that, there was no justification left to ever use it again. Reproductive human cloning, the future that failed before it began. Human cloning is often framed as a question of possibility. Can it be done? Is the technology advanced enough? But the real reason reproductive human cloning is banned has nothing to do with ability. It has everything to do with consequence. When cloning first became a scientific reality through animal experiments, the results were not encouraging. They were alarming. For every successful clone, there were countless failures. Embryos that never developed, pregnancies that ended abruptly, fetuses that formed severe abnormalities, animals born with organ defects, immune dysfunctions, and shortened lifespans. Even the most famous success stories masked the darker truth. The cloning process was inefficient, unstable, and unpredictable. Each success came at the cost of many silent failures. To attempt reproductive cloning in humans would mean accepting the same pattern. It would mean acknowledging that the earliest attempts would almost certainly produce suffering, that some cloned embryos would fail to develop at all, that others might survive only briefly, that deformities, organ failure, and neurological damage would be likely outcomes. And the question that immediately followed was not scientific. Who would those failures belong to? Who would consent to being the first human clone, knowing the risks? Who would accept responsibility for a life created through a process known to produce suffering? What happens to the clones that survive, but not fully? The ones who live, but with bodies that never function the way they should? This was not a theoretical debate, it was a reckoning. Governments realized that productive cloning could not be tested ethically. You cannot iterate human suffering. You cannot justify failed lives as data points. Some knowledge, once examined closely, demands restraint rather than pursuit. International agreements followed. Laws were passed. Reproductive human cloning was banned across much of the world, not because science feared the technology, but because society feared what it would require to perfect it. This is what separates cloning from other scientific frontiers. It is not like flight, where early crashes led to safer planes. It is not like medicine, where early treatments improved through trial. Reproductive cloning would require failure at the level of human lives, and humanity collectively decided that was unacceptable. The ban stands not as a rejection of science, but as a recognition of its limits. Not everything that can be done should be done, and some futures are better left unbuilt.